Picture this for a second. You're a kid, the house phone rings, and nobody rushes to pick it up because you've been told since forever, if it's important, they'll call back. You drink from a garden hose, come home when the street lights turn on, and somehow you're expected to figure things out on your own. Now fast forward a few decades. You're calm in chaos, slightly skeptical of hype, weirdly adaptable to technology, but also deeply protective of your independence. Sound familiar? If it does, you might be part of Generation X. And today, we're diving into the fascinating psychology behind why this generation often feels so quietly resilient, self-reliant, and sometimes misunderstood. Here's the interesting twist, though. People often assume Gen X is just the middle child generation, squeezed between louder boomers and digitally native millennials and Gen Z. But psychologically, that middle position shaped something powerful. It created a generation that learned to observe before speaking, adapt before complaining, and cope before asking for help. And the real question is, was that strength, survival, or a little bit of both? Let's rewind to context, because psychology never happens in a vacuum. Gen X grew up roughly between the late 1960s and early 1980s, a time filled with economic uncertainty, rising divorce rates, shifting gender roles, and the dawn of personal technology. Many became what researchers sometimes called latchkey kids. That's not just a nostalgic label. It literally meant coming home to an empty house, managing snacks, homework, boredom, and sometimes loneliness without constant adult supervision. And here's where the psychology kicks in. Autonomy developed early, but so did emotional self-containment. Have you ever noticed how many Gen Xers have that "I'll handle it myself" reflex? That's not stubbornness as much as conditioning. Developmental psychology suggests repeated early independence wires the brain to expect self-reliance as normal. It becomes the default coping style. That independence can feel empowering, but sometimes it also makes vulnerability uncomfortable. Asking for help can feel almost unnatural. And here's something that might surprise you. Studies on resilience often show moderate childhood stress, not trauma, but responsibility and unpredictability, can build adaptability. Think of it like muscles under gentle resistance. Too much strain breaks them, but the right amount strengthens them. Many Gen X childhoods fell into that gray zone. Enough freedom to grow, enough uncertainty to toughen. But freedom always has two sides, right? On one hand, creativity flourished. This is the generation that helped shape alternative music, indie film, early internet culture, and a certain sarcastic humor that basically became the voice of the 90s. Why sarcasm, though? Psychologists often see humor, especially dry or ironic humor, as a sophisticated coping mechanism. It lets you acknowledge difficulty without being overwhelmed by it. It's emotional armor disguised as wit. Now think about how Gen X interacts with change. They were analog kids who became digital adults. Vinyl to cassettes, cassettes to CDs, CDs to streaming, typewriters to PCs, encyclopedias to Google. That constant technological pivot trained cognitive flexibility, basically the brain's ability to update mental models quickly. And that adaptability is psychologically fascinating because it fosters both curiosity and skepticism. They've seen the next big thing come and go enough times to stay cautious. You can probably recognize that vibe. Not anti-technology, but not blindly trusting it either. It's a "let's see how this actually works" mindset. Psychologists sometimes call this calibrated trust. Not cynicism exactly, but earned belief rather than assumed belief. And honestly, in an era of misinformation, that's a pretty useful mental filter. But here's a more emotional layer that doesn't get talked about enough. Many Gen Xers grew up during cultural narratives emphasizing toughness. Emotional openness wasn't always encouraged, especially for boys. Even for girls, independence often came with an expectation of emotional self-management. That shaped emotional expression styles. You might see warmth, loyalty, and deep care, but sometimes beneath a calm surface, rather than loud displays. And have you noticed how Gen X often values authenticity over polish? That might connect to growing up amid heavy marketing booms and corporate messaging. When you've seen trends rise and fall repeatedly, you start craving what feels real. Psychologically, it's a defense against manipulation, a kind of internal truth detector developed through experience. There's also an interesting career psychology angle.
Many Gen Xers enter the workforce during economic recessions or corporate restructuring. Job security wasn't guaranteed, so adaptability became essential again. That's partly why you see entrepreneurial tendencies, portfolio careers, or pragmatic job attitudes. Work wasn't always identity. Sometimes it was simply stability.
But let's pause on something deeper. Independence, skepticism, adaptability, these sound like strengths, right? And they are. But they can also carry hidden costs. Self-reliance can slip into emotional isolation. Skepticism can morph into guardedness. Adaptability can turn into quiet burnout because you keep adjusting without always processing stress. Have you ever met someone who seems totally capable but secretly exhausted? That's a pattern psychologists sometimes observe in highly self-sufficient individuals. They're the problem solvers, the calm ones, the reliable ones. And because they appear strong, people rarely check how they're actually feeling. Over time, that can create emotional invisibility. And yet, here's the hopeful part. Awareness changes everything. Many Gen X adults today are revisiting emotional literacy in ways their childhood environments didn't emphasize. Therapy stigma has decreased, mindfulness has grown, and parenting styles have shifted. A lot of Gen X parents intentionally give their kids both independence and emotional validation, trying to balance what they experienced.
That intergenerational awareness is psychologically powerful. It shows something called reflective functioning, the ability to examine your own upbringing and consciously adjust. That's not easy. It requires insight, humility, and sometimes confronting unresolved emotions. But it's one of the clearest signs of psychological maturity. There's also this fascinating social bridge role Gen X often plays. They understand analog nostalgia and digital acceleration. They can relate to older, hierarchical workplace norms, but also appreciate younger calls for flexibility and mental health awareness. That translator generation role isn't always acknowledged, but it's psychologically complex. It requires empathy across age groups. And let's talk briefly about media influence, because it matters more than we think. Gen X grew up during the explosion of MTV, cable TV, and global pop culture. Media became both identity mirror and escape. Exposure to diverse music, film, and ideas likely contributed to cultural openness. Psychologically, exposure diversity increases cognitive empathy, the ability to understand perspectives different from your own. But it also created a certain observational distance. Watching the world through screens before social media meant absorbing culture without constantly broadcasting yourself. That might partly explain why many Gen Xers value privacy. Oversharing feels uncomfortable, not because they're secretive, but because their formative years normalized personal boundaries. And boundaries, psychologically, are gold. They protect mental health. They create space for authentic identity. They allow connection without losing self. So when you see that Gen X preference for privacy, independence, and authenticity, it's not disengagement. Often, it's emotional self-preservation shaped by experience. Here's something else intriguing. Research on life satisfaction often shows Gen X reporting both high stress and high resilience. It sounds contradictory, but it actually fits. They carry responsibilities across multiple directions: aging parents, growing children, evolving careers, yet they also possess adaptive coping skills built over decades. Pressure plus adaptability equals quiet endurance. And maybe that's the defining psychological theme here: quiet endurance. Not flashy resilience, not loud optimism, just steady, pragmatic persistence. The kind that doesn't always get Instagram quotes, but keeps families, workplaces, and communities functioning. If you're Gen X yourself, you might recognize both pride and fatigue in that description. Pride because you've navigated change repeatedly. Fatigue because constant adaptation can be draining. And if you're younger or older watching this, understanding that nuance helps avoid stereotypes. Every generation develops psychological traits shaped by context, not character flaws. So what's the takeaway here? Maybe it's this gentle reframe. Independence doesn't mean you must carry everything alone. Skepticism doesn't mean you can't trust. Adaptability doesn't mean endless endurance without rest. Sometimes the strongest psychological move is allowing support, expressing emotion, or simply pausing. Openness, from cultural observers to cultural bridge builders.
That's a profound psychological journey. So next time you notice that calm, slightly sarcastic, quietly capable energy, whether in yourself or someone else, remember there's history behind it. Experiences shaped it, adaptation refined it, and self-awareness can keep transforming it. I'd love to know what resonates with you here. If you're Gen X, what part of this feels spot on or totally off? And if you're another generation, what have you noticed about the Gen X mindset in your life? Share your thoughts below. Keep exploring psychology with curiosity. And if this sparked a new perspective for you, stick around. There's always more to understand about the fascinating ways our minds are shaped by the worlds we grow up in.